This is Punch and Judy from the Incline Press, published in 2024 in a limitation of 160 copies. For those who don't know, Punch and Judy is a traditional British seaside puppet show with roots in earlier Italian performances, and the play features a somewhat violent main character named Mr. Punch and his long-suffering wife Judy, along with a motley cast of other characters. On this occasion, we get a book which was hand-bound at the press by Graham Moss, and it has been bound in these printed paper sides, which have this red and white design. It looks to me like it might have been printed from a woodcut or perhaps a lino cut. It has this telltale texture to it, and the red and white stripes are reminiscent of the kind of booths in which a show would typically be performed. On the front board, we have a yellow title label that's printed with a red border using typographic ornaments. The book uses what I guess we would call a millimetre style binding, so it is quarter bound here in red cloth, but then instead of that cloth extending round onto the front boards as would typically be expected in a quarter binding, it extends under the covering material of the front boards. Talking about the spine, here we have another yellow title label, and then on the back we have more of that red and white striped paper, and then this has been superimposed with this black cut of a sign advertising the next show. And then rounding out the binding, we have striped end bands in red and yellow. So altogether, I quite enjoy the binding. It has a certain homespun quality to it, but I mean that not in a derogatory way. Rather, it gives the book really a certain charm, and I think the design is also well conceived and appropriate for the subject matter. We open up to plain end papers and then a title page where we see some more details about the book. So in particular, this book is going to feature colour cuts by Helen Moss, and we'll see some examples of those in just a moment, although the first example here is in the title itself. And we also see a little bit about the composition of the book. So the book will have three parts. The first is an introduction by Graham and Helen Moss, which gives a bit of a background to Punch and Judy and its history, as well as to this edition itself. Then we have the text of the play itself. And then finally, we have a piece of journalism based on the earliest known interview with a practicing Punch and Judy man. The other thing to remark on here is that the main text of the book was printed from metal types, which was set by hand in Scotch Roman. So we can see some examples of that here. But we also see here several display faces that are typical of 19th century printing. And I think, again, quite appropriate because they're exactly the sort of thing one could imagine seeing on a signboard advertising the next show. The next thing I should comment on is that this book is printed on 170 GSM Liber Charta paper. I first encountered Liber Charta paper when I reviewed Conversation Tree Press's edition of Fawn, and the exciting thing about this paper is that I see people billing it as a successor to the now defunct Zircon mould-made paper, which showed up all over the place in private press editions. So I think this is a paper we may be seeing quite a lot of in the future. And it indeed has many of the properties that people loved about Zircon. So a relatively smooth surface that takes printing well, while also having a little bit of a texture to it, just enough to make it a bit tactile. Good opacity. This example has this nice, slightly off-white coloration, so altogether a nice paper. This is that introduction I mentioned. So now we turn into the play itself, and we see here the first example of those cuts by Helen Moss. They are all relatively vibrant, which I think is in keeping with the spirit of the play. And they all have this perhaps slightly unsettling quality about them, which again is in keeping with the performance. It's very hard to watch a Punch and Judy show and not be slightly disgusted at the characters in the show. I think that's part of its design, and that's really reflected very well, I think, in the illustrations here. The other thing to remark on is that Helen told me in a private communication that there was quite some challenge involved in registering the colours for these prints. All of these engravings are printed in full colour, And Helen, in fact, was obliged to design a new method for achieving that. And I can only say it's been quite successful, because as we flip through and we look at those prints, the registration looked quite flawless. And altogether, I think these prints are superbly executed and a real highlight of the edition to my mind. The other thing that we'll see as we flip through is that the inclusion of images is very generous. I think I counted 15 in total, and in fact that's one for every 2-page spread throughout the duration of the play. So quite a generously illustrated book indeed. The other thing that I enjoyed about the presentation of the play was the typographic plan, and I think that's best seen here on the opening page of the play itself. To me, the design here has a real Victorian austerity about it, and I think that's very fitting given that we're looking at a 19th century text of this performance. If I skip ahead a little bit more, we can see the rest of those illustrations by Helen Moss, and eventually we will arrive at that third part of the book, which is the account of the life of a Punch and Judy man. And so here we see a few new features. So we have 2-color printing. The title here is set in red. We also have this ornamented drop cap. And so it all helps to keep the typographic plan of the book quite interesting. We conclude with this little vignette illustration. And then as usual, we have a colophon page. It's been signed by the binder and press proprietor Graham Moss and hand numbered. So that is Punch and Judy from the Incline Press. Altogether a really nice edition. One thing that quite impressed me about this book is that it's a private press book in the truest sense of the word. So not only was it printed at the press from handset metal type, but it was also hand-bound by the press, and those illustrations were also made under the press's roof. So a completely artisanal in-house job, and I think that's something worthy of respect. I also really enjoyed the fact that this book was very sensitive to the history and in particular the 19th century roots of the text that they were printing, and that's reflected in many of the design decisions that were made in the typography and the illustrations, and they really help to gel with the content of the book to make this a cohesive experience. So altogether, another really nice example of work coming out of the Incline Press.